Baltimore. But on the other side of things, because of the fact that we're getting closer to spring training, we're going to be talking more and more about baseball. And the best one who's locked in on Baltimore, that's the Baltimore Orioles via the Global Satellite Network presented by StreamYard. Connor Newcomb joining me. So I was really surprised about the way the Orioles really carried themselves. So first and foremost, watching this team, they are obviously getting younger. They are getting younger in the pitching staff. They're getting younger in the lineup. But I am liking with what I have seen now from just this past season, even the season before. There's some promising pieces. And looking at it from Cedric Mullins to Adley Rutschman, and now Gunner Henderson, number one prospect in baseball. How big of a future now is this really looking like for the Baltimore Orioles moving forward? Because I think this could be a team that at some point when they get everything together and there's maturity, there's experience, this team could possibly shoot their way up into the postseason at some point, right?
Yeah, I mean, you look at this team, this farm system, and you see that, you had a team bring up Adley Rutschman last year, former number one prospect, former number one overall pick, and he finishes second in Rookie of the Year voting. And honestly, if he doesn't get a tricep injury in spring training and miss the first 6 weeks of the season, he might finish above Julio Rodriguez and win that award last year. And then you look at the odds for Rookie of the Year this year in the American League, the top two guys are both Orioles. It's Gunner Henderson, number one, and it's Grayson Rodriguez, the number two pitching prospect in baseball, number two. And these guys are going to keep coming because, we had all these top 100 lists come out over the last week or so for prospects, and the Orioles had 8 players in each of those lists, and they were different 8 players each time. They had 10 different players in those lists. Nobody had more than 8 in any of them. So these players are going to continue to come to the big leagues. And you mentioned Adley Rutschman and Gunner Henderson. I mean, Adley's already established himself. I think it's going to take a year or two before we're calling him the best catcher in baseball. I think JT Realmuto is the only guy you're going to be talking about in the conversation with Adley Rutschman. I think Gunner Henderson showed that he might even have a higher ceiling just as a hitter than Rutschman does. And we only got to see a month of him in the big leagues at the end of the season last year. The pitching in the system is not what the hitting is at all. So they will have to address that at the major league level. But right now, I mean, the future is incredibly bright. And it's tough because the Orioles really haven't added this offseason a lot. But you can look down in the minor leagues and say they can add 4, 5, 6 talented players just from promotions at some point in 2023.
Yeah, and you got to think too, because I mean, Adley Rutschman's coming from, a pedigree to where they picked up where they left off of with Matt Wieters at the time. I thought he was a really good catcher as well, really good defensively. And even, offensively, there were times where he could really pull through on certain situations. So I think watching Adley Rutschman and seeing the growth and the development. But by the way, I mean, one guy I can name in particular, Ryan Mountcastle. How good has that guy been in the last couple of years of development to where this guy's hitting homers. This guy's driving runs in. I mean, this guy kind of looks like he is really that brute force in that lineup that if I'm looking all around the AL East, I mean, I wouldn't even be wanting to be pitching around a guy like that.
Yeah, the Mountcastle situation is funny because it took him a little longer to get to the big leagues. Because he was coming up when the Orioles were just right in the middle of a full-on tank. And the longer they held him in the minors, the longer he would be an Oriole once he got to the majors. But the other thing was, for years, the Orioles were trying to figure out where he was going to play defensively because he was drafted as a shortstop out of high school. But, that was all the way back in 2015. And back then, yeah, he was a shortstop. But as his, body started to develop, he started to hit more. They moved him to third, and he couldn't really play there. So they moved him to second, and it was a little iffy. So they moved him out to left field and right field, and he couldn't really play there. And they even moved him to first, which is kind of like the last resort for guys. And he kind of struggled there. And the Orioles were just looking at him like, we love the bat, but can we call you up just to be a DH? And luckily for Mountcastle this year, he worked incredibly hard and became an above league average defensive first baseman. And that's all they need out of him when they can get what his bat gives. Now, his numbers were a little down this year from what they were in 2021, but a lot of that has to do with the Orioles moved the wall back 30 feet in left field, made it a completely different ballpark for right-handed hitters, which Mountcastle is. And so some of his power numbers went down. He was also one of the least lucky hitters in all of baseball. His hard hit rates were sky high, hitting line drives at guys all day. His numbers are going to go back up in 2023, and he's a key part of this team. And I think what really makes the Orioles potentially dangerous in this lineup and what makes Mountcastle dangerous is since they called him up in 2020, he's basically hit third or fourth for this team in pretty much every lineup. With Rutschman and Henderson secured in the lineup, plus, your guys like Cedric Mullins and other guys who have continued to hit like Anthony Santander, Ryan Mountcastle is going to settle into like the 6 hole on this Orioles team with a lot less pressure, and he's going to get more pitches to hit because guys are going to want to pitch to Rutschman and Henderson. And I think that's going to make him really dangerous as some of the load is taken off his shoulders, and I expect a huge year for him this year.
Yeah, and I mean, looking at it, I mean, the AL East, it is something interesting because of the fact of Boston had a down year, and it just kind of seemed like they're unloading a lot of different pieces. So I don't know how they'll really pick themselves back up in 23. Look, I've been convinced with the Blue Jays, it's either all or nothing with them because it's like 1 minute they'll have all the potentials to really be a good team, and then they just pitching's not great. The offense can't seem to get rolling, and now it's like they lost their confidence. And the Rays, I think, have honestly been the most consistent team, in my opinion. Because every year there's always somebody different in pitching, but the pitching styles never changed. So I think the level of competition in the AL East, it is really interesting. I mean, you're coming off a year where Aaron Judge, he's an MVP. He, breaks the Yankee record with the most home runs. But for Baltimore, in the pitching aspect, I mean, they got to get things cooking at some point because I've always felt there was a lot of mediocrity when it came to, their pitching staff. I remember the time when they had Charles Tillman, they had Andrew Kashner, they had several other guys, but they couldn't get the guy. Is there, obviously you mentioned about one pitcher in the prospect, lineup of somebody that could really be impactful. Is there anybody else in this this pitching development in this farm system who could be a very, very promising factor for the Orioles in the future?
Yeah, so I mentioned the 8 top 100 prospects. So 2 of them are pitchers right now for the Orioles. One is Grayson Rodriguez, who is a top 10 prospect across the board. He's the number 2 pitching prospect in baseball, and he's ready to go. Now, he should have been in the big leagues last year. He was dominating AAA again. He got to June. Everyone was asking where he was. Then he comes down with a lat injury, and it was a pretty serious lat strain. He misses the rest of the year. And so while he probably should have been in the big leagues before the All-Star break last year, he never made his debut because of injury. Now, it's setting up for him to have a rotation spot on opening day, which is going to be great for the Orioles. He's got incredible stuff, throws in the high 90s with a fastball. I mean, his changeup is Pedro Martinez-like. They got him. DL Hall is the other guy in those prospect lists. Now, he did come to the big leagues late last year. Left-hander who throws 99 with a wipeout slider. Command's been a little bit of an issue for him in his career, which you see a lot with lefties who throw that hard generally. And he came up, he made 1 start as his major league debut, and then he went to the bullpen. And the Orioles used him as a reliever. He actually got a save against the Yankees late in the year in Yankee Stadium. So he's got the stuff to, at the very worst, be an elite reliever. But the Orioles still think he could be a starter. So there's 2 of your options. Now, around those guys, you've got a lot of question marks, a lot of guys who could be good, could be okay, could flame out. You've got Kyle Bradish, who was a nice prospect and had a good year. You've got Dean Kramer, who ended up being the only thing useful they got when they traded Manny Machado. He had a good year last year in the rotation. They just traded for Cole Irvin from the Athletics, who in no way is an ace, but has made 30 solid starts the past 2 years with Oakland, and the O's could use that. They signed Kyle Gibson to be a veteran. But below that in the system, there's a lot of guys where there's still question marks. They've got pitchers like a guy like Drew Rom, who's kind of a left-hander who throws from different arm angles and is really interesting to watch. They got a guy in Noah Denoyer who was actually undrafted and has made it all the way onto the 40-man roster and has some really good stuff from the right side. So they've got some pitchers, even in the low minors as well, who are interesting, but none of them get the national attention, which is why I talk about, they're going to need to add major leaguers basically to this team. But Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall are here to stay. They are 2 elite pitching prospects. And I don't know what their roles are going to be this year. because they haven't really pitched in the bigs. The O's are going to have some innings limits. They're both coming off of injuries. But when they get unleashed, the O's will at least have some sort of punch, whether it's two starters, one's a starter, one's a reliever, that are going to get a lot of guys out.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how that pitching staff really shapes up. And I mean, there's a bunch of real good, promising prospects that are right there that I think hopefully can shape up this rotation, because I know in the big leagues, I mean, anybody could literally expend themselves with the with the relief pitching, because it always just seems like now in this generation of baseball that relief pitching is literally like your baby. That's the one that they're playing with situational positions, and if they're getting out of certain places to where they're holding on to leads or they're giving themselves momentum, even if they're tied up or down by 1 or 2, they're at the very least getting them out of to where the offense is now back on. They could get themselves a couple hits, drive in some runs, and at the very least shift the momentum. So talking about that too. So Cole Irvin now fully acquired by the Baltimore Orioles. And I agree with you too. I don't see him being a full ace. I think he's more of like that 3, possibly 4 guy, like right in the middle, a middle battery for this this rotation. I myself, I don't show my fandom, but I am an A's fan, and I hate to see it where every single one of these players, you build them up, you trade them away. It's the same old spiel. And I'm hopefully waiting to see if they're going to be the Las Vegas A's, because let's be honest, there's really not a market in Oakland for them at all anymore, except out of Alameda, but that's it. But Cole Irvin, what do you see the projections right now as far as being that rotation guy, and where he could literally be that stabilizing battery for even for the next guy, even if he jumps over above him, that he can help out with this rotation to be completely balanced?
Yeah, some of the talk about, the Orioles needing pitching is that the O's went into the offseason with nobody on their roster in terms of starting pitchers who had thrown a full major league season. Even the guys who were returning from last year's rotation either had significant injuries where they missed 2 months, or they maybe joined the rotation at the end of the year, or, in Jordan Lyles' case, the one veteran became a free agent and the Orioles didn't re-sign him. So they went into the offseason with nobody, basically no adults in the room for their starting rotation. Now they signed Kyle Gibson, who at this point is 35. He's a number 5 starter, but he throws, 30 starts every year. He throws 170 plus innings, and he's thrown full major league seasons. So that was nice to have at the end. And what Cole Irvin gives you is the same thing, but a little more moldability, because Cole Irvin is 28 instead of 35. And instead of Kyle Gibson, who you signed to a 1-year deal, and, he could be retired 2 years from now, like he's probably only going to pitch for the Orioles for 1 year. Right. Cole Irvin has 4 years of team control left on his contract. So the Orioles are going to make a few tweaks, probably have him throw his sinker less, throw his four-seam fastball and his curveball a little bit more, and they get him for 4 seasons. And even if he gives you 4 seasons of basically what he gave to the A's, which is 30 starts, 180 innings, an ERA just around 4, if you slot that into 4 or 5 in your rotation for the next 4 years, you feel really good about that, because Irvin's a guy who has pitched 2 full big league seasons. A left-hander, which the Orioles really didn't have in the rotation before making that trade. And those are always important as well, to at least switch things up in your rotation a bit. You don't generally want to have 5 right-handers in there. And he's been around a really bad team. And to be honest with you, like, his numbers were really bad in September and October last year. When you're playing for a team in September that has 45 wins, it can't be easy to pitch your best at the end of a long season. I can imagine coming to Baltimore when things are looking a little better in terms of outlook, that maybe he can sustain how he pitched for 3 months for the final month and a half of the season. And maybe that gives him a little boost. And the big wall in left field, he's had a home run problem in his career. A lot less homers being hit at Camden Yards now because of moving that wall back. So he's never going to come out and, give you 8 scoreless innings, 3 starts in a row. But he's going to be a guy who can stabilize your rotation. He can save your bullpen, and he's a nice piece to add on. Would I have liked the Orioles to get a real ace this offseason? Yes. I said it time and time again on my podcast, but they didn't do it. They ended up with 5 or 6 guys who are solid enough. There's not really a weak link. There's just not that strong link in this rotation. So it's kind of an interesting approach they're taking, and we'll see how it works. But at the end of the day, they didn't give up much, and you get a guy for 4 years who's been pretty solid.
And his contract is inexpensive too. Yes. So that's where you can really thank the A's for that, because I mean, ultimately, they're tight on the payroll, but that's an added plus to where now you could maybe potentially get other guys that can help to surplus, this rotation as well in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you're
So
worried about the money, you don't even really have to worry about it for 4 years because he's inexpensive for 4 years. And if it doesn't work out, you move him to the bullpen, you trade him again, you send him to AAA. The Orioles are worried about payroll, but he's not taking a chunk of it at all.
yeah, exactly. So that's a perfect and ideal position that the Baltimore Orioles want to be in. So, yeah, so with all these young kids, with Ryan Mountcastle, Adley Rutschman, Gunner Henderson, and Anthony Santander, another one that I would like to add too, that I'd like your thought on, who I think he'll be real, real special when he gets to the big league levels, is Jackson Holliday. That kid, I mean, watching him and obviously coming from a pedigree from his dad, who was a big time power hitter. We loved watching him play from Colorado to the A's to St. Louis. How big of an impact could Jackson Holliday really be when this is all completely set, where the momentum, it's getting younger, it's getting set? I mean, he's going to be fitting in beautifully with the future of this Orioles team.
Yeah, and I mean, if things go well, I mean, we're not going to see him in the big leagues this year, honestly. He's 19 years old, but if he's as good as the O's think he's going to be, like 2024 at some point, you could see Holliday in the big leagues. And that's kind of unprecedented for a guy drafted out of high school just 2 years prior. And that could happen in 2024. I mean, the Orioles had a lot of choices with the number one pick. There were 5 or 6 names thrown around, and there's never any kind of leaks at all out of the Orioles system. You generally get a little more leak about who's going number one in any MLB draft, just because that sets off a chain reaction in baseball, sometimes more so than it does in other sports in the draft. But there was never anything coming out. There were 5 or 6 names, and it turned out to be Jackson Holliday. And having his dad be Matt Holliday is great, and he was such a good big leaguer. But Jackson is his own player. Jackson is a left-handed hitter. Jackson's an infielder, while Matt was an outfielder. Jackson is a different kind of hitter as well. Jackson is known, for his power, somewhat like his dad was, but also for his batter's eye. And I mean, the guy gets to the minor leagues and everyone's like, he's 18, he played a high school season. We'll send him to rookie ball in Florida. We'll let him live in Florida for 3 weeks, play some professional baseball, play against, guys that he's way better than, get some confidence and go home. He was so good in a week down there that they said this isn't even beneficial to him because he's so much better than his competition. So they moved him up to full season ball in single A for the final 3 weeks of the season because they were just like, this is not benefiting him whatsoever. Yeah. And then all he did was, I believe, almost double the amount of walks that he had to strikeouts and hit over 300 and use all the fields and honestly dominate that level. And so what that tells me is he's going to be in double A at some point this season, which puts him on a track to get to the big leagues at some point in 2024. And, it's interesting because the Orioles have a lot of good infield prospects, including Gunner Henderson, who plays the same position at shortstop. But if Holliday is what they think he's going to be, I mean, they're going to find room for him. He's going to be on the big league roster in a couple of years here. And I think he just gives you another weapon. And it's hard to see like what the ceiling's going to be and imagine it because he's only 19. He's kind of a smaller kid coming out of high school. And you look at him and you say, some guys get drafted and you're like, yeah, he's 18, but you can see like, the body is already really maturing. For Jackson Holliday, it's almost like, yeah, he looks 18. But then you look what he does on the baseball field and you're like, imagine when he gets in a professional weight room and works with professional hitting coaches.
Yep.
It's going to be fun to watch. And I think just seeing him in the minors this year is going to be fun to see how many levels he can dominate at such a young age. Gunner Henderson had a very similar rise that I think Holliday could have, where Gunner was 19 years old in single A. And then all of a sudden at the end of the year, he was, dominating double A and he had just turned 20 and it happened like that. And I think Holliday could do that too, which if he's in the big leagues in 2024, I mean, the O's are almost ahead of schedule at that point. And, you start thinking more than just, are we, maybe a wild card contender? And maybe that helps if he gets to the big leagues. The O's are just like, our number one pick is here early. Maybe let's spend a little money and add to him too. And maybe that makes the team look a little bit better.
Yeah. And at the same time too, you start to set yourselves up for where it's a stacked lineup. It's set to where it really balances out. I've always said this about, with the pitching staff to the lineups, if you have it balanced to the point where you're getting guys on base, you're like, to me, home runs are honestly nothing to me. Like when you need it, you need it. But if you're driving in gaps and you're driving in those runs, that's the part where if your scoring possibilities are as higher than a lot of these other competition teams, like the Padres, the Dodgers, the Braves, and then you're kind of you're trending in the right direction to where you're a team nobody should even, look past. So, in watching that, yeah, I think Jackson Holliday's got some really good stuff up on him. And yeah, different build. I kind of see him more as not really like a slap ball hitter, but he's the kind that, when you need him to get on base, he's going to get it. And if you need him where he could strive for the gap, he's going to get it. So I think watching that and then seeing him be that part where he could juice up, he could be a potential 1 or 2 in that lineup. And I think he could really strive it to where guys like Mountcastle, Santander, and all of them could now start to strive up for power. So I think it'll be interesting to watching the Orioles and their future, but I'm excited of it because I said to people, I'm like, look, you can laugh at the Orioles all you want, but at least they're not setting themselves up like how Oakland or Miami or some of these other teams, they're still trying to figure themselves out. Like, what do we really have? At least Orioles, they know. Like, look, the Chris Davis contract, I get it. I know it was embarrassing, and I know it was, something they have to obviously swallow that money. But these kids, they're looking like this is going to be really interesting for the next 3, possibly 4 years ahead. And I think they'll be right in the driver's seat by then. It's going to be interesting to watch. But I appreciate you, Connor. Thank you so much for coming up on here into the show. And where can people find you for everything Baltimore Orioles?
Yeah, check us out at Locked On Orioles on Twitter, and then Locked On Orioles is the podcast name wherever you get your pods, and we're on YouTube as well. Make sure to go subscribe, but we're still doing 3 pods a week here in the off season, but once spring training starts sometime in late February, 5 days a week, Locked On Orioles audio and YouTube as well to check out everything you need to know about the O's.
Oh, I love it, man. And you know what? This is always my favorite time of year because now for me, my birthday's in March, and I love it because spring training is right there. And I love it the time when, football season closes, but baseball season, I'm locked in on it like all throughout the year. And I can't wait to see different stories, different prospects come up, be successful. And I mean, this baseball season, the way it's shaping, is going to be really interesting to find out. But thank you so much for joining me, man. Have a great rest of your weekend, and we will definitely see you on spring training and hopefully all throughout the season with everything the Orioles are doing. So catch yourself. We'll definitely catch you on your show for sure. And we'll definitely see you soon.
Thank you.
Absolutely.